Religion is fading away. The notion of God is an illusion. Actually, according to our guest today, Spencer Klavan, graduate of both Yale and Oxford, the opposite is the case. In his new book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, Dr. Klavan says, quote, "Science itself is revealing how deeply the words of creation are etched into the cosmos and into the human heart." Well, I've covered the scientific evidence for God on this channel. The approach we're going to take in this discussion is unique and a new one. Spencer, I've had the privilege of interviewing your dad. It's such a treat to meet you and have you on as well. Thanks for joining us.
Don, it's really great to be here, and I appreciate your making space for Klavan 2.0, the updated version.
Well, some people call me McDowell 2.0, so I can actually relate to that comment,
Yeah, it's the
interestingly
new.
enough. And that's a conversation you and I need to have some other time. But let's dive into your fascinating book. And this is at the end of the book, but you write this. And I want you to just kind of give us the 30,000-foot view approach of what you're doing in the book, and then we'll go back and walk through the details. You said, quote, "We have a choice to make. It is a choice between two visions of the world." What are those two visions? And just kind of lay out what you're hoping to accomplish in your book for us.
Absolutely. Well, I would describe these two visions as the dead machine and the living God. These are really the two ways we have laid out before us of looking at the world, of understanding our place in the universe, and of asking the big questions that we all still ask, even though we don't like to get deep these days. Typically, conversations tend to stay kind of shallow, but at the end of the day, lying in bed at night, facing down life's big challenges, you still come back to these ultimate questions of who we are, what we're made of, and where we're going. And I think the dead machine version of that viewpoint is the one that has been dominating in the Western mind for several centuries, perhaps even 400 years or so. And I grew up with it. I grew up surrounded by people who took it for granted that at the end of the day, what we are is a collection of atoms. We are, as Stephen Hawking once said, chemical scum on a moderate-sized planet. And sometimes people are a little bit more cheery about this viewpoint.
Sure.
If you listen to Neil deGrasse Tyson, there's a kind of mysticism of the atom, that out of these churning flows, billions and billions of years, this raw material, this mindless stuff has collided together to accidentally create us. And when we're over, those atoms will decompose, disintegrate back into nothing, and we will be nothing. So live it up while you're here and let the world be the world. The problems with this view as a philosophy are now, I think, really evident everywhere around us. In my lifetime, the emptiness of thinking about the world this way has become painfully apparent. The tragedy of deaths of despair, the way that people are clearly casting about for higher meaning that the machine view can't provide. I think that's a big part of the crisis that we're all living through. But the other view is one which has been in many ways forbidden to us, and that is the view of the living God, that this was not an accident, it's not a collection of mindless parts, it's a rationally ordered form, a creation spoken into being by a mind that loves utterly and knows all. This is a very scary thing for a lot of people to believe and think about, not only because of the consequences it might have for our ethics and our morality. What does God want from us? Should we maybe think twice before just doing anything we want? But also because of the scorn that's been heaped on the traditional religious, theist, Christian outlook. This is supposed to be a backward superstition that has constrained human knowledge, and anybody who believes in God has to give up his rational mind. And that, too, is a narrative that I grew up with. And as I came to faith and as I grew older, it became clear to me that one of the most urgent things in our time is to clear that obstacle away. And so this book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, is an attempt to do a hard reset on that very idea, that barrier between looking at the world, between us and thinking of the world as a created entity and ourselves as created souls. To tell the story of human knowledge, and especially the story of science, as taking place within the context of a true faith that is rose out of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Science was a product of Christendom in many ways. And now, importantly, as you said, this is the key, science is actually leading us away from the dead machine view of the world. We haven't really grappled with this as laymen, but science no longer describes the world as a collection of mindless parts. And if we really want to, quote unquote, follow the science, we actually ought to be moving back toward the living God.
We're going to get to your case about why we should do that and where you think the science points. But the way you frame this is exactly right. It's a story. And your book, It Hit Me, it's not analytical philosophy. It's not just historical apologetics as much as there's value in that. You're telling a story kind of about the world, this grandiose story, to the moment we find ourselves in today. So to understand our moment, we've got to go back a little bit and retrace some of the things that happened that explain how we got here. Now, as I understand it, there's kind of 3 or 4 main pieces of this story that you tell, although we're generalizing, I think it's accurate. You describe kind of this pre-Socratic view before Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, where some of the first philosophers try to find the unifying principle in the world. Maybe it's fire, maybe it's air, maybe it's water. Aristotle points out what they had in common is they all thought it was material. This shifts with Aristotle, and then you could say maybe it comes to climax over a millennium later plus with Aquinas. So sum up that millennium plus of what Aristotle introduced and kind of climaxed with Aquinas about how they saw the world and why they saw the world the way they did.
Absolutely. Well, as you say, Aristotle is the one who really puts his finger on this. He's doing a review of all the philosophers that have gone before him and what they thought the world was made of. And this is one of the first questions that occurs when people start thinking about stuff is what's out there and where does it come from? And so you have a range of philosophers that are what's called monists, and that word just means that they think everything comes out of one thing. And some of them think it comes from water, that everything is generated out of this kind of oceanic depth of chaos. Some people think that fire is the element that drives all things. Some people think it's air. Some people think it's something a little bit more mysterious. But all of them think it is what Aristotle calls hule, which is just a Greek word meaning stuff, just something you can see. Pretty natural assumption if you think about our most immediate experiences of the world. They're sensory, they're tactile. We look at things and we touch things, and that's how we know them and encounter the world. But Aristotle raises this world-changing question, and he, of course, gets it from Plato and Socrates in part, but he's the one that really puts it in the clearest possible terms, which is stuff is just stuff. It doesn't do anything. By its nature, it's inert. So what makes it move? We actually don't encounter a world just made of raw material. We encounter a world in motion, a dynamic world with potential and action. And when I look at something like fire, I'm not just seeing something like clay sitting there in a lump. I'm actually seeing a pattern of movement and a tendency in the world. And I think this is really the beginning of the thought that will lead, among other things, to the scientific revolution. Because if there's something in matter that is not itself material, that has a tendency, a pattern, even a nature and emotion, then the human mind can begin to understand and try to figure out what the rules are of this motion. But the key is you have to introduce into your world a whole universe of concepts that don't boil down just to raw material. Aristotle talks about potential and actuality. He talks about form and function, right? These things that we also experience in the world. And he opens our eyes to the fact that even our sensory experiences, even the raw walking through the material world, that's not a materialist experience. We have this rational mind that seems able to calculate things like numbers, which don't have any time or place, but apply throughout the universe, billions and billions of light years away. The number two still does what it does here on Earth. And so this mystery, which connects the human mind to something eternal, this is the thread that the Christians pick up. Of course,
Mm.
Christianity, as we well know, very complicated relationship to pagan philosophy and to pre-Christian thinking. But it's Aquinas, as you say, who really baptizes Aristotle and says there's a reason why our brains have this function. There's a reason why we can tap into eternal truths in the world, and that's because we are made in the image of God. Brilliantly connects the Aristotelian scientific worldview with the Genesis account of the Imago Dei, that it's not just an accident that we happen to be able to calculate and chart the movements of the stars. Those stars were mapped out by a mind that then made our minds in a kind of miniature imitation of him. And that's why we can expect to understand the universe, because it's made by a God who wants to be known. And so this is where you get really the birth of the university and the medieval academy. And that's kind of the state of play before the scientific revolution shakes things up.
Excellent summary. That is so helpful to see as we move into the time of Aquinas. You have what some call an enchanted world. Everything
Yeah.
was not material. Angels and demons are real. Miracles happen. God exists. We have
Yep.
a soul. We're not just matter. This is
Yep.
a supernatural realm. Well, although it
Mhm.
took a while for this to kind of be unseated in Western culture, you trace some of the key beginnings to the time of Laplace and scholars in the 18th century. So now
Yep.
that obviously goes up to today, but what kind of shifted? And maybe who would you say are maybe two or three of just the pivotal figures that really
Mhm.
shaped why our understanding of the world shifted?
Okay, this is my favorite part of the story because at the end of it, we get to blame the French. And that's always a but yeah, I think that you use this concept of enchantment, and it's such a powerful idea and such a revealing way of thinking about things that we live in a disenchanted world, as I believe it's Charles Taylor who has said that we move through a world where we, we take it for granted that we're the most advanced living consciousnesses around, and everything else that moves and acts isn't choosing to move, isn't thinking about things. There's not other entities out there in some supernatural realm. Aquinas, of course, lived in an enchanted world. But the key to understanding that is to know that Aquinas didn't live in a different world than we live in. He didn't have different physical experiences. He wasn't describing a world that operated according to different laws. He simply discerned in that world powers and motions that are disembodied, that don't have any particular
Hmm.
location the way we do in time and space, but still have natures. If you think about the planet Jupiter, it moves in a certain way. You can predict the way it's going to move, and it may be that there is a power appointed by God that makes it move across the sky. What happens at the end of the medieval period is that people start to poke holes in some of the logic that drives this enchanted universe. And it's very particular at first. It's guys, eggheads like me, that love archival commentaries, rooting around in Aristotle and thinking like, well, if there's a spirit in nature that moves things, how do arrows move? And why do they fall to the
Mm.
ground? Why don't they just keep going, right? And they start to revise the Aristotelian universe. And this is how, for instance, you first get the concept that will become momentum. This is the first time when some of this stuff we all learned about in physics class in high school, this is getting worked out. Things like momentum and force, right? And it's all a way of trying to correct the Aristotelian picture of the world. But in the process, as we understand these things more and more, we learn that they're actually much more regular than we previously thought,
Mm.
that there are rules that can even be described with mathematics. And not necessarily, but perhaps inevitably, that thought starts to lead to the thought that, well, maybe these aren't beings out there. Maybe this isn't some disembodied force. Maybe this is just a mathematical property of the world. And you start to get the idea that if you don't think about magical powers and entities, you can chart things really well. You can predict things and understand them. And this is what's called the disenchantment of the universe, where the angels are chased out of the world. But one of the things I point out in my book is that's kind of a misnomer, because we do stop talking about angels eventually, but we don't stop talking about disembodied forces. We still talk about force, momentum, energy, right? And we think that those are material terms. This is one of the key mistakes that happens here, is we think those are material terms. They're just as immaterial as angels. I mean, this is things that, if you take a picture of a ball flying through the air, you can't point to me where the momentum is. That's not an object the way the ball is. That's a disembodied, abstract concept to describe its properties of motion, its potential, and so forth. And so the world of spirits gets translated into the world of what will become modern science. Along comes, of course, Isaac Newton, among other very famous fellows, Galileo before him, Kepler as well. You know, these are all names we know. And these guys, devout Christians, are looking at kind of the wreckage of the old Aristotelian scheme. And they're thinking not, how can I get rid of this straitjacket called religion? How can I escape from the nasty church? But instead, how can I honor God by restoring coherence to my description of his universe? Because surely a God who made the universe will make it in a rational way. And that's the project of the scientific revolution, is recovering some stable way of knowing the world at a rational level, because it will honor God, because it will cash the check that's written in Genesis. And you get, of course, Newtonian mechanics out of this. You get this amazing new tool for establishing how the world works and how it moves, for predicting things much further out in space than had ever been predicted before. And it's in the wake of that, as more and more of our world comes to look like it's governed by rational laws, that the generation after Newton starts to wonder whether, if we can explain so much without reference to consciousnesses and angels and thoughts out there, if we can explain so much with just automatic mathematical processes, what if we can explain everything that way? This is Pierre-Simon Laplace. This is the French sort of inheritor of Newton, who is famously rumored to have told Napoleon he has no need of God as a hypothesis, right? This is not a necessary thing to describe the world. And of course, what is hilarious about this in retrospect is that's only true if you've already narrowed your field of vision so entirely that you don't need to look at the immaterial entities or consider what is a mathematical equation, really. It's not an object. It's actually a thought in a mind. And so these things start to fade from view kind of in the 19th century, and after Laplace's generation has passed away, you really do get the rise of atomism and Darwin and all this kind of machine view of the world that we live with now.
That's such a great summary of how we move from the time of Aquinas, and then, of course, the early scientific revolutionaries, Galileo, Kepler, were Christians, like you said. Newton, of course, had some non-Christian ideas about the Trinity, but he was a theist for sure.
Yeah.
And then the way you frame in your book is that we go from Newton, who believed God was behind this and directing it, to saying, wait a minute, if we have these physical laws, we don't need God anymore. This is a sufficient explanation for reality. And with Darwin and with others, not only is God, but the need for human uniqueness moved out. That's the larger story that you tell. Now, we're going to get to where you think the science is pointing today. But I want to read a section from your book, and maybe you can kind of just unpack this for us a little bit. Is this materialist view of the world that can be, in principle, fully explained if we just understand what those principles are, has certain implications, and it gave us a certain promise, really towards the end of, say, the 1800s moving into the 20th century. So I'm going to ask you what this promise is, but let me just read this section and then you can kind of riff on it. You said this story came up with and is still with us today. It goes like this. And this is page 100. Man began among the beasts, but he will not stay there. The creature that once huddled naked under the open air, foraging in the dirt for food, jittering and cringing at every unknown snarl in the grim night. This same pitiable wretch will one day master all of nature. Wielding the awesome power of his new science, he will rest in proud serenity amid the glories of a domesticated world. So, what is that promise? And not scientifically, but did it culturally work?
This is where your point about stories becomes so important, because up to now, we've been indulging in a little bit of shop talk, right? We've been talking about what the actual cutting edge experts in each period believed about the material world, which is in itself, I think, fascinating enough. But what's really interesting to me is any physical picture of the world is going to have implications for our spiritual life and for our ethical life. And so regular people like you and me who are not scientists, are going to live with a story about science or about natural philosophy or whatever it is in our period that kind of hovers in the air. This is not something that was invented with the modern era. Back in the days of the early church, the best that could be known about the natural world was understood to convey higher truths about God's sovereignty, his wisdom, and his rationality, and so forth. Nowadays, we live with a very different kind of religion, but it is still a story that we have derived from what we think about the world. And so out of that Pierre-Simon Laplace idea that everything is atoms moving in predictable ways, a radically revised story about who we are and where we're going starts to take shape. It has to. This is inevitable because, of course, before that, people are telling themselves a story, hearing a story that I believe is a true story about our trajectory into eternity. But that way has now been closed off. And the guy who gets this and sees it before anybody else is a thinker for whom I have no great love, and that is Friedrich Nietzsche. He says mankind, mankind used to look for his destiny in the stars. That way is closed off, so now he looks backward. But there, grinning, stands the ape. And he has this sense that we're now kind of closed in, right? Nowhere to look for a transcendent horizon. So we have no choice but to place all of that mythology, all of that religion, all of that belief into the atomistic universe and to make a faith out of atomism. And I think with Darwin, you really have the last piece of this puzzle, that the world emerged out of atoms churning and we emerged out of organisms fighting one another for survival. And that picture, which is in itself a very brutal picture with no inherent love or purpose or meaning in it, has to be invested with all of this drama and energy and delight. And this is where you start to get the form of thought that will produce Carl Sagan, right? We're star stuff. We're made out of the stars. We come from this primordial soup, but we are emerging into this ever more complex computational machine. And one day we will dominate the nature that produced us. And I think the optimism of 19th century industry was that the more technology we get, the more material comforts we have, the more evolved and enlightened we will become. Ultimately, we will do as Francis Bacon promised, and we will conquer death. And that's where we're going and what's going to happen. You ask how successful it was. I think it was enormously powerful as a piece of rhetoric, to the extent that even now in pop songs, we talk about not the love that courses through our veins, but the serotonin that courses through our veins, right? We are so schooled in this language of kind of materialist philosophy that it is actually bone deep. It affects how we even feel as we move through the world, how we think about ourselves, how we talk about our what I would call our spiritual experiences. As a cultural technology, as a script for building great cathedrals, for making people feel at home in the world, for sanity and for productivity, I would call it an abject failure. I think we're living through its failure. I mean, yeah, we have all been addicted to this materialist way of thinking, but its fruits have been ever less cultural energy, ever more despair, ever more uncertainty and fragmentation. And I think this was inevitable. Ultimately, you were going to run out of steam in this way because the material world can't explain itself, doesn't have enough resources for us to chart a path that is ethical and right through the world, and attempts to do so, whereas they can look very good for a few years, are ultimately doomed to fail. And I think that's where we're at right now.
I first heard about this book of yours through a piece in the New York Times by Ross Douthat, who wrote
Mm-hmm.
this book. He wrote a book called Believe.
Yep.
He's Catholic. He also cited this book by Rod Dreher that just came out called Living in Wonder.
Yep.
And then he cited your book as kind of this move towards a spiritual awakening that's taken place. And all of you kind of attributed in some fashion or another to the failed promise of this naturalistic account of materialism, and that the new atheists have run out. And we realize you get rid of God, this comes with certain consequences culturally, emotionally, and we don't flourish well without it. You
Yep.
talk about in the book how there's a sense of like the science has moved in a different direction than was expected. And we're going to come back to your case for that in a minute here. But do you think on a popular level, there's a kind of spiritual awakening as well, where people are kind of intuitively recognizing this project failed and I
Yeah.
need something else?
I absolutely do. And
Mm,
I think this has been going on for a long time. And by the way, it's not always a comfortable or even necessarily a good thing. It can get easy to be Pollyanna-ish about this when you say, oh, yeah, people are realizing their need for something spiritual. But if you read your Old Testament, you will come to notice that a need for something spiritual can be filled by all sorts of nasty stuff, right? You
that's
can
right.
direct that in all kinds of destructive ways. For instance, you can worship nature. You can pray to the sky gods. And what that ends you up with is the ultimate conclusion that humanity is a stain or a drain upon the God of nature and must cease to exist, which is now an argument that many people are making. Les Knight in the New York Times had a big feature where he basically told the reporter, we're not a good species. We need to sacrifice ourselves for the good of Mother Nature. This is a spiritual outlook. It's a theological outlook, even if Les Knight wouldn't call it that. And I think we've seen all kinds of pseudo theologies take hold of the heart. This is why a guy like Richard Dawkins is so
Mm,
mystified and perplexed by this moment, because he and his cohort of new atheists confidently argued that once we swept away religion, reason would flourish. And instead, what's happened is once we swept away our ancestral religion, all numbers of far more irrational forms of religion took their place because mankind can't live without an ultimate horizon. And instead, what we've gotten is we've gotten political movements that demand genuflection and chanting and all sorts of forms of ancient, even tribal, I would say, worship. So there's that side of our so-called spiritual awakening that is very, very dark. But then there's the side of it that Ross Douthat, I think, is tracing in that piece. And I found that so beautiful. I thought it was a really
mm.
gratifying and lovely approach to all three of the books. He talks about my book, he talks about Rod Dreher's Living in Wonder, and David Bentley Hart's All Things Are Full of
That's
Gods,
right. Yeah.
which is the book that I'm actually reading right now for Advent and
Mm,
enjoying
mm,
enormously. And I think, you're right. All of these books start from the argument that the materialist philosophy has exhausted itself. And I think, you know, what my book adds is that it has exhausted itself at a scientific level. What Bentley Hart is arguing is that it's exhausted itself at a philosophical level. And what Rod Dreher really beautifully suggests is that it is also exhausting itself at a cultural level. And that's what I think you're asking about when you say, like, is there a revival in the works? Yes, and it's going through every level of civilization of our society. I mean, I don't know if you noticed this, but Bibles over the last year, between October 2023 and 2024, Bible sales are up like 22% or
Yeah.
something. Like, and if you've ever published a book, you know that 22% as a sales uptick is mind blowing. And so, like, that's sort of an indicator, I think, that people are reaching for the nearest available source of spiritual consolation and insight and guidance. There's also this whole movement of people like Ayan Hirsi Ali, somebody who's had
Yeah.
a huge, I was a kid, but when I was a kid, she was an atheist because she'd fled an oppressive Islamist regime. Terrible things had been done to her in the name of God. She had understandably rejected the whole idea, but she turned around and she said, as the fearlessly intellectual, honest person that she is, I look at the things I want to protect: liberal democracy, human rights, universal dignity for all persons. And I realized that historically, they're not actually universal. They don't fall out of the sky. They come from a very specific teaching, a very specific philosophy, a way of looking at the world, and that is Christianity. And now, Ali is a great person to think about here because she took the crucial next step, which is to say, if these philosophies have produced all of these wonderful ideas that we wish to endorse and affirm, and if you don't get those ideas without the first principles of Christianity, then we should consider the possibility that Christianity itself is true, right?
Mm.
And that's a step that not everybody is willing to take. And I think
Mm.
both in the popular level and at this kind of higher intellectual level, the question of our times is, can people bite that bullet? Um, you know, the reason that people like me write books like I did is because I want the answer to be yes, but I don't think it's a given that will happen. I think alternatively, they may veer off into a kind of metaphorical Christianity or a New Age spirituality or what have you. And we do see a lot of that as well. But the potential is there now in a way that it never has in my lifetime.
So you tell the story again, pre-Socratics, there's kind of some unifying physical cause, fire, earth, that explains everything. Aristotle to Aquinas brings in a certain kind of supernatural element and component that Aquinas baptizes, so to speak, with a larger Christian message, gives his proofs for God. Laplace comes in, you have figures like Darwin, minimizing the uniqueness of what human beings are. Nietzsche proclaiming that God is dead and what this means for ethics and significance and purpose, etc. You argue, and this is kind of the final piece of your book, and Stephen Meyer did the forward. I want to make sure people know that because they'd be familiar with a lot of the arguments that he makes about DNA, about fine-tuning, about the origin of the universe. But you have a different approach here that I got to be honest, I didn't expect and was new to me when it comes to quantum physics. Now, again, this
Yes.
involves a lot of figures like Einstein, but kind of in the same way you summed up those other periods, sum up what you think has happened in science and maybe why that's so significant.
Gladly. This is, of course, the most exciting dimension of it to me. And I think, as you say, this is what the book has to contribute. I am such an enormous admirer of Stephen Meyer, and that's why I asked him to write the foreword. I think he has covered an enormous range of scientific discoveries that don't have to do with quantum physics, or at least don't require an understanding of quantum physics to grasp them. And those discoveries, too, point us toward a theistic vision of the universe, a theistic interpretation of the evidence. And so in some ways, like, I'm building a little wing upon the giant castle that Stephen has created. But I think it is important to go back to that Pierre-Simon Laplace moment, this moment of peak atomism, when a kind of post-Newtonian material mechanical philosophy starts to take hold. Because it's in that moment that Laplace writes a very famous essay on probabilities. And the point of that essay is actually that if we had enough information, there would be no probabilities. There would only be certainties. Because, he says, there would be a perfect mind that could know the position and momentum of every particle in the universe. And for that mind, past, present, and future would lie open before him as if he were omniscient. Because these basic material facts, locational data, and quantitative facts about atoms and particles contains everything you need to know that locks the universe into this rigid set of laws. And from that idea, you can easily get your way to predicting something like Darwinism and something like Freudianism, even that everything is this automatic, mindless process of physical material laws that can be quantified. The reason this is so important to grasp as a moment in history is because Laplace was wrong. He was dead wrong at a physical, scientific level. And that's what the quantum revolution is about in it's preceded, and this is a part of the story that not everybody grasps, but Thomas Kuhn wrote about it brilliantly. It's
Mm-hmm.
preceded by Ludwig Boltzmann and what's called statistical mechanics, which is a way of figuring out how gases move in a room. It's much, much more than that. It's about entropy and how particles bounce off one another and diffuse into the world. And the question that scientists are trying to figure out is, well, when you diffuse a gas into a room, right, if you start with a small cloud of gas, it will ultimately expand into the biggest, most diffuse area it can. Why doesn't it ever go back? There's nothing in the laws of physics that makes it impossible for the gas to just cloud back up into that little collection. Why doesn't it ever go back? And the answer Boltzmann comes up with is that each collision of each gas particle in that cloud, if you will allow me to nerd out for just a second here, like each collision is not actually 100% determined, even if you know everything about their motion. You can't say for sure whether it's going to bounce off at like a 45-degree angle or a 46-degree angle, to again simplify things. Instead, what you have is probability. You have more and less likely outcomes of each one of those little collisions. And once you add all those collisions up together, you get a vastly more likely outcome, which is the diffusion of the gas and the possibility that entropy is going to go backward and time will run in reverse and the gas will recollect is so vanishingly small that it can affect never to happen. Great solution, Boltzmann, to this problem. Also, radically undermining the entire premise of Newtonian mechanics. And it's that idea, when it gets carried into the world of light and the question of how light travels and how radiation moves, that idea in its analog at the particulate level translates into quantum physics. And what quantum physics says essentially is what we're looking at when we look at the raw materials of matter might not actually be little chunks of stuff after all. It might be something more like a collection of probabilities, things that might be but are not. You know, when Frodo is meeting the Lady Galadriel and she pours the water into the pool and she says, the mirror sees many things, things that are, things that were, and some things that have not yet come to pass, right? That's quantum physics. It's like there are some things that have not yet come to pass and they are actually indeterminate at the level, at such a profound level that until those things come to pass and until we observe, for instance, the motion of subatomic particles through a screen with two slits in it, until we observe that, we actually can't say anything about their definite location. We can only say something about their possibilities, and all those possibilities with their various likelihoods exist in one moment. They're not. It's not as if they are sort of different colors or smudges on a screen. It's that they are all true at the same time until the future resolves itself into the present. Now, why does this matter at all? Well, what that turns out to imply is that what we're dealing with out there in the world is not just a pre-existing box of stuff with all of these quantifiable properties like location and texture and size and shape and all of that, but rather a field of possibility that takes on the properties of material and position and location in time when it makes contact with us, that we have the power or the property of resolving the world into what we see around us, which is a material world. But that world in itself is not the end of the story. The real story is a marriage or a relationship between the human mind and whatever else is out there outside of us. This makes our consciousness, our awareness of the world, potentially into a fundamental ingredient of reality. It's not just an accidental byproduct of atomic motion. It's actually akin to matter in its essence, its essential nature, that this stuff can't be erased. You can't imagine us away. You can't cancel out humanity. We're actually an essential part of creating reality. And if that's true, then the mind itself is actually an ingredient of reality and potentially indispensable for existence, which is where I ultimately take the book to say, if that's the case, then you actually need a mind there from the beginning. You need a consciousness or something like our consciousness to set the universe spinning. And once you're there, you're basically in the book of Genesis.
Now, we're going to come back to some of the specifics of your case, but I want to point out to make sure our viewers don't miss this. As you argue from the beginning, mind has always been a part of reality, and we never really escaped it. And this is on page 5 of your book in the introduction. You say, somewhere in our hearts, we are still certain that the world has order. We believe the human mind is not an accident. We expect there to be answers to our scientific questions, and it feels like a promise. And then you make the point that order, meaning, and harmony, these are more than physical things. And you said earlier that numbers are not physical. I'll take my kids and I'll write the number 5. And I'll say, if I erase that, did I destroy the number 5? No. There's a difference between a numeral and the number. Now, what happened with this obvious common sense intuition that we have about order, design, and purpose is that we were kind of talked out of it by the scientific revolution. Now, you do raise a few questions in your book. For example, if we could just observe everything and reduce it down to objects, well, who's doing the observing? Because that's not a physical process itself. So in many ways, it seems to me there's kind of a paradox that quantum mechanics is so incredibly counterintuitive. And yet, on the other hand, it actually is intuitive because it implies there's a kind of mind involved in the universe itself. Do you agree with that breakdown? Tell me your thoughts on that, and then kind of bring it full circle why you think quantum physics points towards God.
Yeah, I love that way of putting it. I mean, there's a commonplace saying that if you think you understand quantum physics, you don't understand it. And I get why people say that, because so many of the concepts in quantum physics are paradoxical from a purely materialist point of view of the universe, right? If you think that everything is just objects, then it's meaningless to speak of something being in two locations at once or taking two paths until observed and collapsing into one, right? Not so, not paradoxical, in fact, if you think that there's more to the world than just objects. And even the way we talk about the challenges of quantum physics is already kind of gives the game away as reveals us as materialists, because the entities of quantum physics defy materialist assumptions. They defy what we think of as matter. And what I would say is not so much that you can't understand quantum physics, but that if you think you can picture what's going on in quantum physics, then you don't understand quantum physics. If you think you can draw a picture in your head of what's happening when photons move through a half-silvered mirror, then you haven't really gotten there yet. And this is because, very importantly, it's in quantum physics that we start to reason about things which are by their very nature outside the sphere, the realm of our observation. That's why things start to break down. Once we get to things that we can never in principle observe, because by definition we're not observing them, or we want to know how they act when we're not observing them, it turns out that those things cease to have the properties of an object in space of the kind that we experience in the everyday world. And there are those who would say that doesn't prove that our consciousness gives them those properties, just that when they enter into our consciousness, they have those properties. But either way, what we're basically saying is the world as we see it and as we experience it is just that. It is the world as we experience it. And outside of us, it takes on very different characteristics. Now, this is all extremely trippy and counterintuitive, as you say. But why is it that it leads us back to a much more normal and intuitive way of looking at the world? Well, because it introduces back into our minds the idea that form as a property of the mind is actually a constituent part of reality, that matter without mind doesn't have the necessary properties to exist in the sense that we think of things existing. And once you wrap your head around that, you're actually much closer to thinking the way people have been thinking for millennia before the scientific revolution. You're much closer to saying, oh, the world as we experience it isn't just a world of raw material, it's a world of raw material imbued with these supernatural or even just immaterial things like form and logic and reason and meaning. And all of those things can only exist, so far as we know, in a mind. There is nothing other than a mind that could possibly contain something like a form or a number or a mathematical principle. And so if you want to say that at the beginning of the world, there were just these bare laws, which is one thing that materialists love to say. I mean, Stephen Hawking said this in the Wall Street Journal, right? Like the world comes into being just with a few bare physical laws. Then you are ultimately thrown back again on saying, well, whose laws? Who wrote them? Where did they exist? The only answer can be in some ultimate or primary mind. And this is, again, the way that most people have thought about these things for a very long time. And so quantum physics fits perfectly into the ancient Aristotelian picture and Thomistic picture of the world. It doesn't fit so well into the aberration which was the mechanical philosophy, and that's why it blows people's minds.
I think the other problem with saying that the universe came from laws is that laws do not have causal power, just like numbers don't have causal power. Minds do. So they can't explain anything. At best, they're descriptive. That's just to add somewhat to the case and critique you're offering. Now, at the end of the book, you move from this kind of this argument you're making about quantum physics to specifically, and I don't know if this is the right word, but it's somewhat expected or it fits within a Judeo-Christian tradition. And we always have to be careful to not read too much into the Bible from modern science. Either it's bad science or it's bad exegesis. But maybe give us just one example where you say, you know what, Scripture either expected this or we shouldn't be surprised, or this better helps us understand what Scripture has said for thousands of years.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing I always want to be really clear to say is I do not think that God gave the author of Genesis a sneak peek of the Schrodinger equations. That is not what I am arguing, right? The fact that Genesis describes the world in a way that is marvelously, even beautifully consonant with quantum physics is a result not of quantum physics having informed Genesis, but of Genesis describing the world so entirely that quantum physics, among a number of other things, follows the patterns that we find articulated in the Genesis story. Genesis story gives us a template for thinking about the real bedrock of reality. And I think that is one of its primary beauties, and one of the gifts that it gives us is in the creation story, when God speaks the cosmos into existence, we get kind of the bare elements of being laid out before us. And part of that is this idea that in the beginning, right, there was God. In the beginning, God said. And so we have this idea of one mind with thoughts, ideas to communicate. And then we have this communion between that mind and the tohu vabohu, the formless void, right? The thing that is indeterminate that he's going to give shape to over the course of time. Now, fast forward many, many years, you get to the Big Bang, right? One of Einstein's most alarming, one of the ideas that most alarmed Einstein, because it came out of relativity in part, but Georges Lemaitre, who figured it out, was a priest, and when he brought it to Einstein thought, oh my gosh, this is opening up this whole door for theological speculation, because the universe has a beginning, right? And this is something that Stephen Meyer does write about very beautifully. Like, if in fact it is the case that cosmology begins with a day with no yesterday, which is how Lemaitre put it, well then what comes before that, what comes outside of it, how do we get that beginning moving? And all I'll have to add here from the quantum physics perspective is, yes, and if in fact that beginning was what they call a singularity, that is to say, operating within Planck space at this very, very tiny physical level, then the laws of it were either quantum laws or something yet more paradoxical that we haven't even yet been able to understand. I mean, at the very first moments of the universe, this is one of the big, exciting, open questions in physics right now, is what laws could possibly have governed this tiny object, this quantum object. But the minute it starts to move, the minute we get into the very first seconds of the universe, or even microseconds of the universe, we are talking about those quantum objects that we discussed earlier, those objects that don't actually have location and position in space and time until, so far as we know, they get observed. And so this is a picture of the universe that starts to look more and more like an observing mind in relationship with a formless void. That is something with no definite shape or form until it receives it from the mind that observes. And I'll go just one step further to say, if you run the clock out about 360,000 years, I think it is, you eventually reach a point at which light, for the first time, is able to escape from matter. And the reason that's important for us is because that's the oldest light that we're able to observe. And we can see it in, for instance, old television static has a little bit of this. It's called the cosmic microwave background radiation. If you turn on an old TV, you will see light, ancient light from the beginning of the universe, but not from the very beginning, only from 360,000 years after the beginning of the universe, which means that that whole period before light escaped is blocked off from our observation. And there's a radical disjunct, almost as if there was evening and morning the first day. I mean, these periods that the universe gets divided into even start to take shape as we learn more about cosmology. And, I'm not telling anybody that they have to take exactly this interpretation of Genesis, because again, I don't think that Genesis gives a description of the world the way that science gives that description. But as we begin to talk about these things, they start to look more and more like the kind of world that is described in Genesis.
Half of my audience who disagrees with your interpretation of Genesis just lost their minds. No, I'm just kidding. We don't have to discuss.
Never listen to the podcast again. I hope that's okay with you.
We don't have to debate interpretations of Genesis. I do find it interesting. You say on page 170, in a purely physical sense, it may be literally true that light holds the world together. Now, to me, this is not a proof, but of course, the Bible talks about how Jesus holds all things together. And I've been reading the Gospel of John with my son in the morning, who's 12. And Jesus, over and over again, is the light healing the blind man. He's told about the lightness. That illuminates me a potentially different way of looking at Scripture, not a proof, but there's just more than a strange connection there that I find powerful. Those are some of the things you unlock in your book that I want viewers to make sure they get a copy and check it out. But let me ask you this question, because you deal with, some people would say things like, this talk about quantum physics points towards New Age. You offer a brief critique of that, a postmodern critique now. If we are kind of our minds between us and reality, do we have access to reality? You address that. But you ask this question, and I want you to address it on page 194. You say, if the world is dependent on the way we perceive it, how can truth be anything more than a figment of our imagination? Respond to that question that you raise.
Well, this is an important thing to guard against, I think, because quantum physics, especially when it first became publicly known, did give rise to all sorts of kookiness, all manner of kind of new agey and, as you say, even postmodernist ideas that, the world is what you make of it. And of course, the answer to that is try jumping out of a fourth-story window and making gravity what you make of it, right? Like there are obviously facts about reality,
right?
And to unmake those facts has been one of the disastrous cultural efforts of our time. But it's an understandable attempt, because the deadening idea that everything is locked into these rigorous material laws naturally makes people want to escape and find some region for human freedom. And I think postmodernism and New Age woo-woo have both been kind of attempts to do that by veering all the way in the opposite direction, saying we can just like create the world with our consciousness. The problem with this at a scientific level is it's just not how this works. One of the most amazing and remarkable things about quantum physics is that once I've observed, say, the polarization of a photon, I can't unobserve it. I can't decide that it's going to be something different than it was the first time I observed it. I can't even really decide what it's going to be, except in a range of possibilities. Those possibilities are resolved in my observation, but I don't get to pick what they are. And then even more importantly and more remarkably, you don't get to pick that there's something different than I have observed. That observations are public. They belong to all of humanity in this way that mysteriously kind of joins us together as a species. We are all observing the same world, and once one person has observed something, it then holds good for everybody else. Why might this be? Well, one possible answer is because of what you said, that light holds the world together. This idea that as particles interact with one another and then ultimately with us, they become what's called entangled. That is, their states are bound up with our states, means that in that moment of observation, that particle that I've observed has a state that is now bound up with me. And since I'm not going to change, I am a continuous non-quantum entity. That particle is going to be the way that it was when I observed it. And since you and I are interacting with one another in relationship, the particle is also in some sense bound up with you at a million removes. So we are not only in relationship with the outside world, we're in relationship with each other, such that we actually share a world and can talk about it and can be in relationship. All of which sounds to me as if the whole thing is constructed so that a shared reality can be built upon by soul after soul after soul. This is, I think, I speculate, I think this is why God made more than one person, right? Is that there is an enormity of his existence that is never exhausted by any one experience of him, any one relationship with him, except perhaps that of Christ, in which we all are, as you indicate.
I think he also made us that way to need each other and see the world differently in a way that another perspective would not.
Yeah.
So your response to this is great. You write on page 195, you say, no one can refuse to see a rainbow when the light strikes him just right, nor can I decide that there's a rainbow in my room on a dark morning. This is also true for immaterial things, right? I can't just decide that someone loves me who doesn't love me. I can't change facts about history which are not physical. I can't make torturing a child for fun morally right if I want to. So there is a mind-independent world that is material, but also immaterial, that is not touched or affected by the insights you're bringing about quantum mechanics that are seen is that the world is in some sense dependent upon how we see it. It's not one or the other. Now,
we can't.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we can't unmake the moral universe at will, but not for lack of trying. But you're right.
I love that. And by the way, I want to point out one of the underlying things in your book that you say is our view of what it means to be human has consequences. So this materialist view is that humans are just a chunk of clay and can be molded and manipulated to whatever ends we desire. That's at the root of Marxism. And yet, if there's an objective human nature and truths we can't change, then Marxism is not only going to fail, it's going to have disastrous consequences. And in fact, we saw that in the 20th century and beyond. Now, I got one last question for you, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Reading this book alone, I could tell you're at least within the Judeo-Christian tradition, but I wasn't sure. I was like, are you particularly a Christian? Now, of course, you've made that clear in other avenues, and this is not a critique because that's not the point of the book, but you are a Christian. So if somebody said, all right, Spencer, this points towards there being some mind, but this could be consistent with maybe Islam. It could be consistent with Judaism. It could be consistent with a range of faiths, maybe pantheism in some sense. Why are you a Christian? And do you think there's evidence that points towards that other people should similarly consider?
Yeah, thank you for that description of the book. I'm actually pleased to know that it doesn't make my particular doctrinal or denominational commitments clear, for the reason that I think this is prior to choosing a religion, right? The idea that there is a God is prior to which God do I, and people have to get past that threshold. So I wanted to make the threshold as wide as possible in this particular book. But I do talk about Jesus in the book in some of the terms that we were describing. And that's because there is a piece of this that I don't think you can get without Jesus. Yes, we are in relationship with the universe. Yes, the universe comes into being in part through our relationship with it. And this implies that there's an ultimate relationship between mind and matter at the heart of things from which we are all derived. What that doesn't necessarily lead you to is the idea that the ultimate mind has a personal relationship with each one of his individual minds, and that our individuality is important to God. You might say that we are sort of shards or emanations of the divine Godhead, and when we pass away, we will all be reabsorbed into the consciousness. But this is not the Christian notion. The Christian notion instead is that God has himself a personhood and individuality, and his concern actually is to maximize our individuality so as to maximize relationship. There's a wonderful passage in C.S. Lewis where he talks about the angels in Isaiah singing holy, holy, holy to one another. And he says, even in a group of friends, right, each friend draws something new out of all the other friends. So if you lose one friend, if somebody dies, you've also lost some piece of all the other friends. And if you think about this after death, then you can imagine a beatific vision, a communion with God that refracts God through as many souls as have ever been created, that each soul, seeing God in her own way, contributes something to all the other souls' vision of God. And I find this to be the maximally beautiful and also the maximally coherent idea about what we are. Because if we really get down to it and we scrape away kind of all of our philosophizing and we think hard about what we don't want to rejoin the cosmic soup, even if that has a certain bliss to it, or even if sometimes we might like to fade away into obscurity and oblivion. What we actually want is bliss, is the thing for which we were made. And that's what sold me as a teenager on Christianity, was that there is a personal relationship that I've actually felt as a very young person, with everything. And that relationship is a relationship between all that is, and perhaps the creator of all that is, and not just humanity, but you, Sean, and me, Spencer. And those things, though broken by the fall, that individuality is actually the ultimate point of all of this stuff. That's why we care about any of it, is because people themselves have an irreducible worth and value. And I think it's the incarnation that puts the seal of approval on that fact.
Spencer, this is one of my favorite interviews in a long time. Really enjoyed reading your book. It expanded my horizon, made me think about stuff. A few stuff I ran by my wife. I was like, hey, what do you think about this? And so I love the contribution. Really appreciate you taking the time to come on. Want to commend to my viewers. It's called Light of the Mind, Light of the World, forward by Stephen Meyer. And you write, given your PhD from Oxford in kind of ancient Greek literature, you write and just tell a story. So I think the words kind of leap off the page and draw a viewer in. At least that was my experience. So really appreciate you coming on. We will do it again. Now, folks, before you click away, make sure you hit subscribe. We've got some other conversations coming up on science and faith, on cultural issues, evidence for the Bible, near-death experiences, and more. You won't want to miss it if you've thought about studying apologetics. We have Stephen Meyer come do classes for us, interestingly enough. Full-time program. We have information below. We also have a certificate program where we'd love to just train you in apologetics if you're not ready for master's. That's below as well. All right, folks, we'll see you soon. Spencer, thanks again for joining me.
John, it was such a delight. Thank you so much for a great conversation.